Is it possible to spend a lifetime loving someone only to discover that their love for you was a lie? Imagine a man who dedicated his life to preserving history, only to realize the most important story was being rewritten right under his nose by his own son. I was there in the quiet, rolling hills of the Cotswolds, and what I witnessed was a truth so devastating it made me question everything I thought I knew about family. Picture this: you're a proud man, independent and sharp, living in a home filled with the last echoes of a life you cherished with your late wife. Then, in a split second, a simple fall changes everything. It's not the physical injury that hurts, it's the way your son looks at you, not with concern, but with something else. Something cold and calculating. This is a story about a man named Arthur, a retired professor who faked his own decline to uncover a truth that would either set him free or shatter his world. Today, you will learn how he used his sharp mind to expose a betrayal so deep it made the past seem far less painful than the present. Every moment counts. If you ignore this lesson, you might never see the subtle signs that a loved one's concern is a mask for something far more sinister. Stay with me until the very end, and you will discover the one thing Arthur did that led to a heartbreaking revelation. A final gut-wrenching moment that proved the deepest wounds are not the ones you can see, but the ones inflicted by your own blood. You won't believe what his son was truly planning. I've always been a man of habit, the kind of man who still folds his shirts the way his mother taught him, who sharpens his pencils before writing in his journal, and who eats his toast with just the right amount of marmalade, never too sweet. My name is Arthur Davies. I'm 78 years old, retired from a long and mostly quiet career as a history professor. I live in a modest stone cottage in the Cotswolds, where the air still smells of wet moss and chimney, smoke, and the silence is broken only by birdsong and the occasional bleat of a wandering sheep. Eleanor, my late wife, and I bought this house in 1976. She passed 5 years ago, and since then, I've kept everything just as she left it. Her knitting basket still sits by the hearth, untouched. It was a Tuesday, April I think, because the daffodils were bowing their bright yellow heads in the garden, and the wind had that damp bite that always arrives just before spring gives in completely. I remember because I had just finished pruning the rose bushes, something Eleanor used to do with such elegance. My hip had been giving me trouble lately, but I stubbornly refused to use the cane I kept hidden in the umbrella stand. Around noon, I decided to retrieve a volume of Bede's Ecclesiastical History from the top shelf of my study. I shouldn't have climbed the stool, but I did. A moment of dizziness, a slip, and down I went, clumsily, not dramatically. My hip throbbed, but nothing was broken, just a bruise. Still, I sat there for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, feeling not old, but betrayed by my own body. Michael arrived within the hour. Clara, too. He must have some kind of alert system on me, because I hadn't even called him yet. He stormed in, breathless, holding his phone like it was a badge of authority. "You could have cracked your skull open," he said, his voice riding that fine line between worry and scolding. I told him I was fine, that I'd fallen plenty of times before, that this wasn't worth the fuss. But something in his reaction didn't sit right. It wasn't just concern, it was urgency. He kept scanning the room, touching the edge of the bookshelf as if measuring it. Clara was oddly quiet. She always is. That night, I couldn't sleep. My hip ached, yes, but that wasn't it. Something in my son's eyes had unsettled me. A calculation, perhaps. Or maybe it was guilt. Either way, it didn't match the trembling hands he placed on my shoulders or the tone of his voice. I sat in the dark with a single lamp on, rereading old letters Eleanor had written to me while I was still teaching at Cambridge. I found comfort in her words, her tidy cursive, her endless kindness. But I also felt a strange stirring inside me. something I hadn't felt since she died, a need to know, a desire to understand what had changed in my son. By morning, I'd made my decision. If Michael believed I was slipping into confusion, then that's what he would get. A slow, gentle decline, nothing too dramatic, just enough to loosen lips and reveal true motives. I practiced it in the mirror, forgetting where I'd placed my glasses, asking the time twice, mumbling names under my breath. It felt absurd at first, but there was a certain power in it too, like becoming invisible in plain sight. People speak freely when they think you're not listening. When Michael arrived for his usual Wednesday visit, I answered the door with a blank look. I waited a second longer than usual to recognize him. "Oh, Michael, yes, of course," I said, as if searching my mental index. His eyes narrowed and he looked at Clara, a shared glance. I shuffled back into the living room, mumbling about the kettle. I purposely left the stove on a low flame without the teapot, just to see if he'd notice. He did. "Dad, you forgot the water," he said carefully, like one might speak to a child. I let my eyes dart toward the stove in mock surprise. He stayed longer than usual that day, kept watching me, while pretending to scroll through his emails. I pretended to nap on the armchair, half listening. That's when I heard it, a whisper from the kitchen. Clara's voice, barely audible. "If we wait too long, the market might drop again." And then Michael's reply, just as soft but sharp as a scalpel. "He won't last the year, not like this. We just need the paperwork in place." My stomach clenched, the kind of clench that no age can soften. I kept my eyes shut and my breathing steady, suddenly aware that I had started something I might not be able to control. Later that afternoon, when they left, I stood in the doorway watching their car disappear down the lane. The same lane Eleanor and I used to walk on Sundays, hand in hand. My hands were trembling now, not from age or fear, but from a slow, rising fury. I sat down with a pen and paper and made a list. Not of groceries, not of books to read, but of questions. What were they really planning? What paperwork? And what the hell did he mean by "he won't last the year"? The next day, I began shifting things ever so slightly, placing a sock in the tea cupboard, pretending not to recognize the gardener, leaving the front door ajar after bringing in the milk. Little inconsistencies, enough to build a narrative. Michael returned on Saturday unannounced, which was rare. He brought brochures this time, places with names like Oak Haven and Willow Grove, with smiling nurses and men playing chess under sun-dappled trees. "Just to have a look," he said too cheerfully, "just in case." I nodded slowly as if I were unsure what he meant, then asked him if Eleanor would be there too. He didn't answer. That night, I stayed up organizing my thoughts like a war general preparing a siege. If they wanted to push me out, they'd need to show their hand first. I wasn't going to accuse anyone without evidence. That's not the historian's way. I went back to my journals from last year, tracking every time Michael had brought up the idea of moving. The frequency had increased after Eleanor's anniversary last September. That meant something. Perhaps it wasn't grief that triggered it. Perhaps something else had changed. Debt, pressure, a secret they couldn't contain. Sunday came with rain, tapping lightly on the kitchen skylight. I made tea, real tea, not the mess I'd left the other day, and sat near the window in my usual cardigan, the one Eleanor had knitted with the crooked left sleeve. That morning, I hid the folder with my will under the loose floorboard in the study, just in case. I also pulled out the house deed and placed it in the top drawer of my desk. If Michael came snooping, I wanted to see if anything was out of place later. I had to know if they were already searching. Michael didn't show up that day, nor the next. I started to wonder if I had overplayed my hand. Maybe the act had rattled him, but on Tuesday he returned alone this time. No Clara. His voice was softer, his steps slower. "How have you been?" "Feeling, Dad?" he asked. I told him I'd forgotten the days, that sometimes I woke up not knowing if it was morning or evening. He leaned forward, eyes sympathetic, but his fingers tapped restlessly on his knee. Nervous, guilty, or both? Then he asked me something strange. "Do you remember signing those documents I left last time?" I blinked at him. "Documents?" I echoed. He nodded. "Yeah, just the ones for the house tax, remember?" My heart thudded in my chest. No such papers had been left. I would have remembered. His eyes searched my face, waiting for recognition. I gave him none. "Did I?" I murmured. "I don't recall. You should ask Eleanor." It was a calculated jab, and I watched his jaw tighten ever so slightly. That night, I rifled through every drawer and cabinet. Nothing had been moved, no new documents, no forgeries. But something was clearly in motion. He was testing to see how much I remembered, or how little. I opened the old cigar box where I kept Eleanor's letters, and, nestled among them, I found a note she'd written in 2014. "If Michael ever pushes too hard, trust your instincts, not your fear." She always had a way of seeing through people, including our son. I spent the following morning deliberately wandering through the village, feigning confusion. I asked the grocer if today was Sunday, though the church bells hadn't rung. I pretended not to recognize the vicar's wife and called her Margaret. Her name is Joyce. By the time I returned home, word had, "You traveled." I saw the concern in Mrs. Pembroke's eyes, the way she gently touched my arm and asked if I needed help with my bags. "Oh, no trouble," I told her. "My boy is taking care of everything now." The words tasted bitter on my tongue. The plan was working, but with it came an ache I hadn't anticipated. To be treated as fragile, fading, forgetful. It wasn't just an act anymore. It started to settle into my bones like damp cold in old stone. I wasn't losing my mind, but I was losing something. Trust, maybe, or pride, or perhaps just the last pieces of dignity that come from being seen fully, clearly, and with respect. I went to bed early that night, the house too quiet, my mind too loud. Wednesday arrived with a chill that crept through the window panes, the kind that made the floorboards moan and the kettle take longer to boil. I didn't open the curtains right away. I sat in the armchair by the fireplace, staring at a photo of Eleanor from our trip to Whitby in 1982. Her scarf was flying in the wind, and she had that half smile she reserved only for me. I whispered to the picture, "I think our boy is hiding something, Ellie." The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage. Every corner watched, every silence loaded. Around midday, Michael returned. This time he brought food. Ready meals, low in sodium, high in implication. He spoke slowly, as if I might forget mid-sentence. "I thought it might help you not have to cook so much, Dad." I nodded. "That's thoughtful." "Michael, very thoughtful." I let my spoon clatter to the floor when I pretended to forget what I was eating. His eyes flicked to it, then to me. He picked it up and offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're doing great, really," he said. I could hear the rehearsal behind those words. Then he brought up the house again. "You know," he began, "Clara and I were thinking, maybe it would make more sense if we handled things from now on. The upkeep, the taxes, it's a lot." I looked at him for a long time before speaking. "You always did hate this house," I said softly. He looked stunned. "No, Dad, that's not what I waved a hand dismissively. "It's all right. You don't have to like it. Just don't pretend to love it now." I saw the hurt in his eyes, but I also saw something else: frustration, impatience. After he left, I sat with the silence again. It was thicker now, like fog. I opened my notebook and began writing every sentence he'd said that day, as best as I could. Remember, I underlined the word handled, such a slippery word. It can mean help or control or take over depending on the tone. I added it to the list. Then I brewed myself a proper cup of Earl Grey, sat at the kitchen table, and planned my next step. I needed a witness, someone neutral, someone who could see what I was seeing. I rang my old friend Harold, who still lived in the village, a former solicitor with a sharp mind despite his gout. "I need your eyes and ears," I told him. He didn't ask questions, only said, "Come by tomorrow, bring biscuits." I felt a small surge of warmth. Maybe I wasn't entirely alone in this game of shadows. I spent the rest of the evening preparing, laying out old documents, marking dates, listing names. If this was to become a battle, I wouldn't fight it unarmed. That night, I left the porch light on. Not for me, for Michael. A silent message. I see you. I know something's wrong. The wind howled through the hedges as I went to bed, and I imagined Eleanor beside me, her cold feet pressed against my calf, her whisper, "Don't let them take what we built." I closed my eyes with those words still ringing in my head. I dreamt of fire, of the house burning, of books curling into ash, of Eleanor reaching for me through the smoke. I woke with a start, sweat on my neck, the sheets twisted. It was 3:27 a.m. I got up, checked every lock, every light, every window. Nothing was wrong, and yet everything was. I stood in the hallway, staring into the dark, feeling the weight of history pressing down on me. Not the history I taught, but the one I was living. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Not just watch, not just pretend. I needed proof, concrete, undeniable. Enough to confront Michael with, if it came to that. I dressed carefully, press shirt, cardigan, Eleanor's favorite brooch pinned to my chest, and prepared myself for whatever the day would bring. The sun was rising, timid and pale, a thin gold line over the hills. A new day. Perhaps the last one I'd spend as just an old man in a quiet house. By the time I reached Harold's cottage, the fog had begun to lift. His place was smaller than I remembered. A squat little structure with ivy climbing the stone walls like stubborn memories refusing to be trimmed. He opened the door in his slippers, his face pale and amused. "You look like a man about to stand trial," he said, stepping aside. I smiled faintly. "Not trial," I replied, "but perhaps an inquisition." We sat in his tiny kitchen over tea and shortbread. I laid out my suspicions like puzzle pieces, careful not to dramatize. He listened in silence, eyes narrowed. When I finished, he leaned back and tapped the table. "Arthur, you're not wrong to be cautious. I've seen things like this before. Children with too much ambition and not enough patience." I flinched at the word children. Michael was 48, a grown man, a father himself. "Do you think he's planning to sell the house?" I asked. Harold shrugged. "I think he already has a buyer in mind." That hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just the loss of bricks and mortar, it was the betrayal. The fact that he wouldn't even wait for me to die properly. Harold offered to help review any documents if Michael tried to slip one past me. "But Arthur," he said carefully, "you can't play this role forever. The deeper you pretend, the more you risk becoming the man they think you are." That line stuck with me. On the walk home, I kept hearing it again and again. I'd become so immersed in this performance that I'd started talking to myself more, leaving lights on, confusing time. Some of it was deliberate, but not all of it. That afternoon, Michael showed up again, alone, as usual now. He brought me a framed photo of the grandchildren, which he placed on the mantel next to Eleanor's urn. I stared at it longer than necessary, then asked him, "What are their names again?" His expression tightened. "You know their names, Dad." I furrowed my brow. "It's just so hard to remember sometimes." He didn't respond. He looked at the floor, then at me. "Do you want me to help you organize your things? Maybe start packing some of the books?" I blinked slowly. "Am I going somewhere?" He hesitated. No, I just thought to make space. For when we bring in help." That was new. Help. A vague word, but one that changed the rules. "A nurse?" I asked. "A companion? A stranger in Eleanor's chair?" He didn't answer, just picked at the corner of the frame he'd just placed. I knew then that the house was already half gone in his mind, stripped of sentiment, converted into leverage. When he left, I sat in the kitchen again, watching the teapot steam. The house, so full of quiet before, now felt like it was holding its breath. I walked through each room, touching furniture, brushing my fingers along shelves and banisters. Each item had a story, a year, a laugh attached to it. It wasn't just a house. It was the only place where my memory still lived outside my own mind. If they took this from me, they weren't just taking walls. They were taking Eleanor. They were taking me. Later, I opened a new notebook and titled the first page, "Things I Will Not Let Go." I wrote slowly: the rose garden, Eleanor's chair, the photograph of our honeymoon in Wales, the smell of dust in the study, the way light fell on the piano keys at 5 p.m. I filled 4 pages before I stopped. This was not just a list. It was a declaration, a final will of sorts. If they wanted to dismantle my life, they'd have to do it over my living, breathing resistance. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in Eleanor's chair, facing the window, and waited. I wasn't sure for what. A sign, a confession, a miracle. But the only sound was the wind brushing the ivy along the outside walls. Still, in that stillness, I made a promise. The next time Michael brought up the house, I'd confront him. No more hints, no more performance. I would speak plainly and ask what he really wanted, and I would not look away when he answered. Thursday began with sun, unusually bright for early April. It streamed through the lace curtains and cast golden patches on the wooden floor. I took my breakfast slowly. 1 poached egg, 1 slice of toast, tea just barely steeped. I dressed carefully, not for an outing, but for what I knew would be a conversation that mattered. I had a quiet resolve in my chest, like a man who's chosen to walk into the storm rather than wait for it. I placed Eleanor's brooch on again. Somehow, it gave me courage. Michael arrived just after 11, knocking once before letting himself in, which he'd begun doing without asking. That small change, no longer waiting for me to open the door, said more than any word. He found me in the living room, seated upright, not pretending, not frail, just me. "You're looking well today," he said, almost suspicious. I nodded. "I feel well. Clear." That word lingered in the air between us. He shifted, uncomfortably. "Listen, I wanted to go over some things, just some paperwork." I stopped him with a gesture. "Michael, sit down." He obeyed slowly, like a student called into the headmaster's office. I looked at him, not as my son, but as a man, one I no longer recognized. "I need to ask you something, and I want the truth." He blinked, caught off guard. "Of course." I took a breath. "Why are you so eager for me to leave this house?" He started to speak, but I raised a hand. "Please, no euphemisms, no talk of safety or concern. I want the real reason." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because we're in trouble," he said finally. "Clara and I, financially. The business took a hit last year, and then again in February. We're stretched thin. I thought if we sold the house, we could pay off the loans and start over." I felt the room contract around me. "So this was never about me," I said. "Not really." He looked away. "It was about both of us. I thought you'd be better off in a place where someone could look after you." "That's not your decision to make," I said, more calmly than I felt. "This house is not just property. It's memory, it's history, it's my life." His mouth tightened. "You're alone, Dad. You forget things. You fell." I looked at him. "I fell once, and I pretended the rest." That made him pause. "What?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, I pretended, because I needed to know why you were pushing so hard. And now I do." He sat back stunned. "You've been acting senile." I shrugged. "I've been acting like a man being hunted." We sat in silence, the kind that carries the weight of everything that's just been said. Then he asked, almost whispering, "Do you hate me now?" I shook my head. "No, but I don't trust you, and that might be worse." He swallowed hard. I was desperate. I stood up. "Desperation doesn't excuse deceit, Michael. You didn't ask. You plotted. That's what hurts." He looked older in that moment, smaller, like a boy who broke something and didn't know how to fix it. "I can't give you this house," I said finally. "Not now. Not like this. If you had come to me honestly, Perhaps, but you didn't. So no. He nodded, slowly, like a man being sentenced. I understand. And strangely, I believed him. Not because he was sorry, but because the game was over, and there was no more pretending left to do. I walked him to the door. For the first time in weeks, I opened it before he reached for the handle. He turned at the threshold. "What will you do now?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "Live," I said, "in my house, on my terms, and maybe plant more roses this spring." He nodded. "All right." And then he left. No hug, no handshake, just a man stepping off the battlefield. I closed the door behind him and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. After he left, I didn't move for a long while. I sat in the hallway, back against the door, as the quietness of the house settled back into place. Not the same quiet as before. This one was heavier, tinged with grief. Not for a death, but for a fracture, something that may never fully mend. I knew, even as I told him I didn't hate him, that part of me would always carry the bruise of his betrayal. And yet I also knew I hadn't lost everything. I still had this house. I still had my story. And that at least was something. Later that afternoon, I returned to the garden. The earth was damp, soft from the morning sun. I knelt slowly by Eleanor's roses, her beloved yellow ones that bloomed brightest in June, and pulled away the weeds that had begun to crawl through the soil. My knees protested, but my hands worked with quiet steadiness. There was something sacred in the dirt, something eternal, a promise that even after harsh winters, things could bloom again. I whispered to the petals, "He tried, Ellie, but he won't take this from us." Back inside, I brewed a new pot of tea and sat in the kitchen, notebook open. In front of me, I wrote everything down, every word, every pause, every look from Michael. I didn't do it to build a case anymore. I did it to remember, to make sure I wouldn't forget how close I came to losing the last thing I had. I titled the page, "The Day I Chose to Stay." Underneath, I wrote the date. And then, without much thought, I drew a line beneath it, like sealing it in time. Around 5, I called Harold. He answered on the second ring. "It's done," I told him. He admitted it. Harold exhaled audibly. "And?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. I told him no. I told him the truth. And I think, no, I know, it's over. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, "Proud of you, Arthur, truly." It was one of the few times anyone had said that to me since Eleanor passed. I felt it settle warm in my chest, like a log catching fire on a cold evening. I slept that night for 10 uninterrupted hours. No dreams, no ghosts, just sleep. When I woke, it was with a lightness I hadn't felt in months. The birds were louder than usual, or maybe I was just hearing them differently. I sat by the window with my tea and watched the world move slowly outside. The postman waved. A boy passed on his bicycle, scarf trailing. Life hadn't changed, but I had. That was enough. Michael didn't call the next day, nor the one after, and that was fine. I needed the silence, needed to sit with everything and let it settle. I wrote letters, not to send, but to understand. One to Eleanor, one to Michael, one to myself. In the one to Michael, I wrote, "You are still my son, but trust is a garden. You trampled mine." I sealed it in an envelope and placed it in my drawer. Maybe one day I'll give it to him. Maybe not. By Sunday, I'd begun to make small changes. I moved Eleanor's chair slightly closer to the window, reorganized the bookshelf by year instead of author, started cleaning the attic, not to throw anything away, but to touch the past again, with intention. Each item I found, a photo album, a box of old letters, the dusty globe I used to teach geography with, was a thread in the fabric of who I was. And I needed that reminder. I was not a man fading, I was a man reclaiming. That evening, I walked down the lane Eleanor and I used to stroll every Sunday after church. I took my time. The sun was low, golden against the stones. I paused at the bend where she used to stop and fix her scarf, always claiming the wind had a vendetta against her. I laughed softly to myself, then sat on the bench we always shared, and for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel haunted. I felt held. On Monday morning, I received a letter, handwritten, addressed in Michael's unmistakable slant. I stared at it for a long while before opening it. The envelope felt too heavy for what it was. Inside, a single page, no greeting, no sign-off, just this. I didn't know how to ask. I thought if I framed it as concern, it'd be easier. I see now I was wrong. I'm sorry. No elaboration, no explanation of what would happen next. Just that. I folded it neatly and placed it inside the same notebook where I had recorded everything else. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel anger. What I felt was clarity, a stillness that comes not from peace, but from finally understanding your place in someone else's story. Michael hadn't intended to hurt me, not at first, but when the pressure mounted, he saw me not as his father, but as a means to an end. That realization changes something in a man. Not violently, not suddenly, but deeply, like a stone sinking beneath still water, slowly, until it disappears. That afternoon, I called Clara. She sounded surprised. "Arthur?" she asked, cautious. I told her I wasn't calling to argue. I just wanted her to know that I didn't blame her entirely. "You stood in silence," I said, "but sometimes silence isn't neutrality. It's consent." There was a pause, then a trembling breath. "I didn't know what to do," she said. "I was scared we were drowning." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Next time you feel that way, don't reach for someone else's lifeboat. Build your own." I hung up gently, and that was the end of it. The next few days passed in quiet routines, dusting the bookshelves, feeding the robins in the garden, writing entries in my notebook. I stopped pretending to forget things. I spoke to the grocer by name. I called Joyce, Joyce. I returned to being myself, publicly and proudly. The villagers, kind as they are, didn't ask questions. Perhaps they knew more than they let on, or perhaps they understood the sacredness of not asking when a man is reclaiming his dignity. One evening, I visited the town solicitor, not Harold, he's long retired, but a young woman named Edwina, with sharp eyes and a soft voice. I asked her to help me revise my will. I removed Michael's name from the deed, but not from the inheritance entirely. I couldn't do that, not yet. Instead, I added conditions. The house would pass on only if it remained in the family as a home, not a transaction. I placed a letter in the folder addressed to him, sealed. "You will inherit what you respect." Nothing more. She read the clause twice, then looked at me. "This is unusual," she said, "but legal." I nodded. That's all I need it to be. When I left her office, the sky was bruised with approaching dusk, and I walked home slowly, hands in my pockets, thinking not of loss, but of the strange fullness that comes from setting boundaries. From saying with action, "You may not cross this line again." Back home, I took Eleanor's shawl from the cedar chest. It still smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. I wrapped it around my shoulders and stood at the front window, watching the lights flicker on in the village. My reflection stared back at me, older, yes, but upright, steady. Not a man unraveling, but a man rebuilt. I whispered aloud, "This is still my house, and I am still here." That night, I lit the fireplace and let it burn. Well into the early hours, I played one of Eleanor's old records, Debussy, I think, and read aloud from her favorite book of poetry. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt attentive, as if it too had been waiting for me to return. Not just to walk its halls, but to inhabit it fully, to take back the parts of myself I had given up too quickly in the name of fatherhood, of fear, of survival. The days that followed settled into something softer. I resumed my morning walks, taking the longer, in path that winds behind the chapel and leads to the overlook where Eleanor and I used to sit on summer evenings. The trees were just beginning to bud again, tiny green promises sprouting from brittle branches. I brought a small journal with me. And some days I wrote letters to people I would never send. One for my father, one for Eleanor's sister, one for Michael, from the version of me that didn't feel betrayed. I began noticing the small things again, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. When I passed by just after opening, the sound of the school children shouting near the square, the squeak of the old swing behind the churchyard that no one oiling ever seemed to fix. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was paying attention without suspicion. I wasn't scanning for manipulation or lies. I was simply living. It didn't erase the past, but it made the present breathable. On a Friday afternoon, as I trimmed the hedges, a familiar voice called out from the gate. "You missed a spot," Harold teased, leaning heavily on his cane. I smiled and waved him in. We sat under the apple tree, each with a glass of lemonade. He looked at me the way old friends do, with all the history between them visible in the silence. "You look lighter," he said. I nodded, because I'm no longer pretending, and I'm no longer guessing. He raised his glass to that. We drank slowly. He told me his granddaughter had just been accepted into university. "Cambridge," he said proudly. "You know, the same department you used to teach in." I felt a surprising pang of something like joy. "Tell her," I said, "that it's less about being the smartest person in the room and more about being the one who listens the longest." He smiled. "Sounds like something Eleanor would have said." I nodded. "She said it to me once, the day before my first lecture. After Harold left, I sat in the garden until the sun dipped below the hedge line. I thought of Eleanor's voice in my memory, as vivid as any living sound. I remembered how she used to narrate the weather like it was poetry. "The clouds are sulking today," or "The wind's in a hurry this morning." I started saying it aloud again, just to hear how it sounded. "The roses are gossiping today," I whispered to no one, and somehow that made me feel less alone. The following week I received a package. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters. Inside was a photo album. New, handmade. The first page had a single photo. Me, standing in the garden, clipping roses taken from a distance. Below it, in Clara's handwriting, it said, "We see you now." I turned the pages slowly. More photos. The grandchildren. Michael, candid and smiling at some family gathering I had missed. No letter, just images, but something in it felt like an offering. I placed the album on the coffee table and sat back. I didn't cry, but my chest felt full in that aching way beauty sometimes brings. Maybe it was a peace offering, maybe guilt, maybe just love expressed awkwardly. Whatever it was, I accepted it. I didn't need revenge, I didn't want estrangement. What I wanted, what I still wanted, was to be known, fully, truthfully. And that gesture, silent as it was, felt like a small beginning. I wrote one more letter to Michael that night, not one to store, one to send. I kept it short. "I saw the album. Thank you. I meant what I said, but I don't want this to be the last chapter. Come when you're ready. The garden's still growing." I folded it, sealed it, and walked it down to the postbox myself. The night was cool, and the stars were sharp against the dark. As I dropped the letter in, I felt something shift. Not an ending, but a loosening, a space being made. Days passed, and I resumed my old habits with quiet pride. I returned to organizing my library, this time not as a distraction, but as a way of re-establishing order. I moved the books Eleanor loved most to eye level, placing her favorite novels beside mine. It felt like building a dialogue between us again. I even dusted off the typewriter I hadn't used in decades, just to hear the sound of the keys clicking. It reminded me of when we were young, when words came easily and the future seemed endless. One morning, I received a phone call. Michael. His voice was unsure. "Dad," he said, like he was afraid I might not answer. "I got your letter." I waited. He added, "I'd like to come by, if that's all right." I said yes, without hesitation. Not because I'd forgotten, and not because I was ready to forgive everything, but because I believed in repair, in slow, deliberate repair. He asked, "Tomorrow?" I said, "Tea's at 4. Bring your hands. The rose bushes need deadheading." That night, I didn't sleep out of anxiety, but anticipation. I set the table in the kitchen the way Eleanor used to. Mismatched cups, her favorite tea cloth, the small blue vase with a single bloom from the garden. I rehearsed nothing. I made no speeches in my head. I just kept my hands busy, trusting that the house would do what it always had, hold space for difficult truths. I sat in her chair for a while, watching the door, remembering the last time Michael walked through it as my son, and not just a man with a plan. The next day, he arrived on time. No brochures, no briefcase, just him and a small brown paper bag. "I brought scones," he said awkwardly, "from the bakery in town." I nodded. "Good ones, not too sweet." We settled in the kitchen. The silence at first was stiff, then soft. He looked older, or maybe I was just seeing him more clearly. He didn't apologize again, not outright. But he said, "I didn't expect you to see through it. I thought you were tired." I raised an eyebrow. "I am tired of being underestimated." He smiled faintly. "Fair." Then he added, "Clara's the one who made the album. She said it didn't feel right, what we did. I guess we didn't know how to step back." I stirred the tea slowly. "That's the thing about pressure. It doesn't just crush, it distorts, makes people think they're doing the right thing while walking over others." He nodded. "It wasn't right, any of it." I let the words hang, then reached for a scone. "Well, at least you didn't bring another contract." We talked about the children, about Clara's new job, about how life keeps happening, even when we think we've frozen in place. He asked if he could walk through the garden, and I said yes. As he wandered among the beds, I watched from the window. He bent down to touch one of Eleanor's roses, the same yellow ones he once ignored. I wondered if he remembered their name. Golden Celebration. She used to say they were the happiest flowers. Seeing him there, I felt something soften in my chest. When he came back inside, he looked around the living room. I didn't really see this house before, not properly, just walls and value. I nodded. "It's more than that." He looked at me, and this time, really looked. I know now, and for the first time in a long while I believed him, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, without defense, without strategy, just a man trying to start over. As he left, I walked him to the door. He paused before stepping out. "Will you come visit sometime?" he asked. "Maybe for Lily's birthday?" I smiled. "If there's cake?" He laughed. "Always." And then he walked back down the lane, the same one Eleanor and I used to stroll. I stood there watching until he disappeared around the bend. And then I closed the door, not on the past, but on the need to carry it alone. That evening after Michael left, I sat in the armchair by the fire with a blanket over my legs and the house resting around me like a familiar sigh. I didn't feel victorious, and I didn't feel wounded either. What I felt was something quieter. Release. The weight of suspicion had lifted. The ache of betrayal hadn't vanished, but it no longer had teeth. I looked around the room, the books, the faded cushions, the framed photographs, and I saw not a fortress I had to defend, but a sanctuary I had chosen to keep. I stayed there long after the fire died down, listening to the night creak through the old beams. There's a peculiar stillness in English cottages after dark, the kind that makes your thoughts echo a bit louder. I thought about how close I'd come to losing everything, not through force, but through slow erosion. That's how it happens sometimes. Trust isn't shattered, it's worn away, like stone under years of wind. And I realized then that repair is not about restoring what was, but building something new on what remains. The next morning, I decided to write again, not just letters or notes, but properly write. I pulled the old typewriter from the study, dusted it off and loaded it with fresh ribbon. The first sentence came slowly. "This house did not save me. I saved myself inside it." I paused, then typed another, and another. Before long, I had 2 full pages. Not memoir, not fiction. Just a man speaking plainly to the paper, telling the truth as best he could. It felt like oxygen. Over the following weeks, Michael called more often. Not long calls, just enough to share a thought or ask about the roses or tell me Lily had lost her first tooth. I didn't rush to bridge the distance, but I let the threads stay connected. Sometimes we must let others do the work of reaching. Clara wrote once more too, a proper letter this time. She told me she had found new work in Oxford and that she hoped one day I might visit. I pinned the letter to the corkboard above the kettle. One Tuesday, a boy from the village knocked on my door, asking if I still gave history lessons. "Mum says you used to be a professor," he said. "I hate history, but I have to pass the exam." I smiled and invited him in. His name was Thomas. We started with the Romans, and he interrupted every third sentence with questions I hadn't been asked in years. It was marvelous. He came back the next week and the next. Made a routine of it, tea, biscuits, and the slow unearthing of the past. The house began to feel lived in again, not just occupied. I started leaving the door open when the weather was fair. Neighbors dropped by with jam or questions or just to sit for a spell. I found myself laughing more, saying yes more often. I even agreed to join a local book group at the library, though I warned them I'd probably argue with every recommendation. "As long as you bring biscuits," the librarian had said. And I did. On a rainy Thursday, I found myself humming as I folded laundry, a silly old tune Eleanor used to sing while sweeping. I paused mid-fold and looked up, startled by the sound of it in my own voice. It was the kind of moment that catches you off guard, not sad, not joyful, just complete, like finding a letter you didn't remember writing, but recognizing every word. I sat down and let it echo in the kitchen for a while, not chasing it away. That evening, I pulled out one of Eleanor's scarves, one she wore every spring. I tied it loosely around my neck before stepping outside. The air was damp and the path slick with rain, but I walked anyway, past the hedge, down the lane, up to the overlook. I stood there for a while, looking at the grey hills and the wind-tossed treetops, and I said aloud, "We're all right, you and I." It wasn't a question, it was a truth, and I believed it. A week later, I received another letter, this time from Lily. The envelope was pink, covered in stickers, and addressed in large, uneven handwriting to Grandpa from Lily, age 6. Inside was a drawing of the 2 of us in a garden, surrounded by oversized yellow flowers and a cat that looked suspiciously like a hedgehog. Below it, she had written, "I love your house. Mommy says it smells like old books and cookies." I laughed out loud. It was the best review of my home I'd ever heard. I pinned her drawing on the refrigerator, right next to an old postcard Eleanor once sent me from Edinburgh. It felt right. 2 eras of love-sharing space. That afternoon, I sat down and wrote a reply, careful to match the tone. "Dear Lily, thank you for the beautiful picture. The flowers made me smile, and the cat is very brave. You're welcome in my garden anytime, especially if you bring cookies." I drew a clumsy flower in the corner before sealing it. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed being seen through a child's eyes. Later that week, the book club met at the library. We discussed A, Room with a View, and I made my usual fuss about the characters lacking backbone. Edna, the widow who hosted, argued fiercely with me, and I found myself enjoying the exchange more than I'd expected. "You're just bitter because they're not historians," she said. I replied, "I'm bitter because they think emotion is enough to carry reason." The group chuckled. For the first time in a while, I felt like part of something bigger than my own solitude. After the meeting, I lingered at the library, scanning shelves without a real goal. I stumbled upon an old volume of essays on memory and place. The spine cracked as I opened it, and the pages smelled like my university office, ink, dust, and time. I checked it out, even though I already owned a copy at home. Some books deserve to be touched again in a different context, like people, like houses, like old griefs reintroduced as gentle memories. The next day, Harold came by unannounced. He brought a tin of shortbread and a grin. "Thought you might be in need of intelligent conversation," he said, "but since I wasn't available, you'll have to settle for me." We sat in the study, talking of things we'd both already said before: retirement, weather, back pain, but somehow it all felt fresh again. There's comfort in revisiting familiar paths with someone who knows where the bends are. At one point, Harold looked at me over his cup. "You've changed, Arthur. Not in a bad way, just less defensive, like you're not waiting for the sky to fall." I nodded. "I think I finally realized that I'm allowed to keep what's mine without apologizing for it." He smiled and leaned back. "Well, it only took you 78 years. I chuckled. "Some of us are slow learners." That night, as I locked the doors and turned out the lights, I paused by Eleanor's photo on the mantel. "It's getting easier," I whispered. "Not because you're fading, but because you're still here in all the right ways." I touched the frame briefly, then walked into the kitchen to put the kettle on. The house felt full, not crowded, not loud, just full, as if it had stretched to make space for something new without displacing the old. I began drafting a piece called "The Geography of Grief." It wasn't meant for anyone in particular, but it came from somewhere deep. I wrote about how grief doesn't vanish. It just finds new rooms to live in. Sometimes it moves into the attic. Sometimes it sleeps beside you. Sometimes it gardens. But always, it becomes part of the landscape, no longer a storm, but a stone. Something solid, something ancient, something that stays even when the weather changes. As spring deepened, the garden transformed. The daffodils gave way to tulips, and the roses began their slow, deliberate unfurling. I spent more and more time outdoors, trimming, watering, sometimes just standing still and watching bees at work. There was something deeply reassuring in their focus, their refusal to panic. They simply did what they were meant to do. I thought often of Eleanor as I worked, not with sadness, but with companionship. Her presence had become something ambient, like the scent of lilac in the breeze, noticeable only when you slowed down enough to inhale. One afternoon, Thomas came by for his lesson with a packet of digestive biscuits and a question about the Cold War. "Why didn't they just talk it out?" he asked, frustrated. I smiled. "Because trust takes time to build and seconds to destroy. And power, well, power tends to speak, louder than understanding." He looked thoughtful. "That's stupid." I nodded. "It is. Most of history is." We spent the rest of the hour trying to map alliances using colored pencils and far too much tea. His laughter filled the kitchen, and I realized how long it had been since young energy had bounced off these walls. That evening, I took down the heavy drapes in the living room. They'd always made the space too dark, and Eleanor used to complain about them constantly. "These curtains make me feel like I'm living in a museum," she once said. I smiled as I folded them and stored them away. In their place, I hung light linen ones I found in a box marked "Summer Things." When I stepped back to look, the room felt brighter, lighter, less like a place frozen in memory and more like a place moving with the present. One Sunday morning, Michael returned, this time with Lily. She ran up the path and into my arms without hesitation. "Grandpa," she squealed, "I brought my flower book." I knelt down beside her and examined the little notebook full of pressed petals and crayon scribbles. "These are marvelous," I told her. "You're a proper botanist." She beamed, then leaned close. "Mum says I got your cleverness." I raised my brows. "Well then, the world had better prepare itself." Michael stood at the gate, watching quietly. He looked unsure, as if seeking permission to approach. I gave a slight nod. He came in slowly, hands in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the garden. "It looks better than I remember," he said. "You've done well with it." I didn't reply, not out of coldness, but because it felt unnecessary. The moment wasn't about words. It was about Lily discovering snails under the rose bushes, and me kneeling beside her, showing her which ones would nibble leaves and which would leave them alone. After tea, they stayed longer than I expected. We played a short game of dominoes. Lily insisted on making up her own rules, and then she helped me water the seedlings in the use of a greenhouse. Before leaving, she hugged me again and whispered, "Can I come next Sunday too?" I nodded. "You can come any Sunday you like." As they left, I stood at the gate and watched them walk away. Michael turned back once, raised a hand. I raised mine too. It was the closest thing we'd had to ease in years. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept Eleanor's letters. I chose one at random and read it slowly, tracing her cursive with my fingers. It was from our second year of marriage, full of small domestic complaints and one perfect line: "I hope one day our home will feel full, even when it's just you." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Then I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, careful not to crease the paper any more than time already had. I slept well that night. No dreams, just the steady warmth of something returning, not innocence and not certainty, but peace. The kind you earn, not by forgetting what went wrong, but by choosing what you want to. Carry forward. In the quiet moments before sleep took me, I thought, maybe this is what healing looks like. Not loud, not final, but slow and almost invisible, like ivy growing back over a scarred wall. The next few Sundays became ritual. Lily would arrive with dirt under her nails and questions about every leaf, every worm, every stone in the garden. I'd save her a biscuit and a clean trowel. Michael came too, though he often stayed in the background, letting her take center stage. I noticed he didn't bring up the house anymore, not its future, not its value. Instead, he brought stories, work stress, school drama, Clara's promotion, ordinary things, human things, things I didn't realize I'd missed hearing from him. One afternoon, as Lily napped on the couch, Michael and I sat in the garden with mugs of strong tea. "You know," he said, "I still don't fully understand how you figured it all out, that I was lying." I shrugged. "Because I know how you sound when you're being honest. You inherited your poker face from your mother, not me." He chuckled, looking down at the rim of his mug. "I don't deserve this second chance," he said. I replied, "Most of us don't, but we try to earn it anyway." There was a long silence, not uncomfortable. Then he said, "I don't think I ever told you this, but when Mum died, I was afraid you'd disappear. Not die necessarily, just fade. Stop talking, stop being." I looked at him, surprised. "That's how it felt," he continued. "Like you were slowly unpacking away parts of yourself." I nodded. "I was. I didn't know how to be a man without her reflection in me." He exhaled. "Maybe I should have said something back then." I smiled gently. "We're saying it now." That conversation opened a gate that had been locked for years. Over the following weeks, we spoke more freely about grief, about our mistakes, about Eleanor. Sometimes we cried, sometimes we just sat. I realized then that forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's a practice, something you do over and over without guarantee that the other person will always meet you halfway. But when they do, it creates space, not to forget, but to grow around what's been broken. In early June, Lily brought me a small journal she'd started. She called it Things Grandpa Knows. Page 1 read, "Roses need space to breathe. So do people." I laughed out loud and kissed the top of her head. "You're going to run this village someday," I told her. She grinned. "Maybe, but only if you help me." I nodded. "Deal," she added. "Also, you make the best toast, but don't tell Mum." It was the highest praise I'd received in years. That night, I sat at my writing desk and opened a fresh page in my own notebook. I titled it, Things I Almost Lost. I wrote, trust, autonomy, legacy, my son, my sense of self. Then I turned the page and wrote another title, Things I Got Back. And there, I paused. Because the list wasn't the same. It wasn't symmetrical. Some things don't return. But what comes in their place can still be enough, maybe even more than enough. A few days later, Harold stopped by with news that he was moving in with his daughter in York. "The stairs here are winning," he joked, tapping his knee. I felt a quiet sadness bloom behind my ribs. "Will you visit?" I asked. "Of course, if only to see if you've finally joined the modern age and bought a mobile phone." I laughed. "Unlikely." We hugged at the gate, two old men in cardigans, holding onto a shared past. I watched him disappear down the lane just as I had with Michael, and silently thanked the village for giving me such people. That evening I returned to the bench under the apple tree, the same one where I had sat with Harold, where Lily had sorted petals, where Eleanor once embroidered quietly while I read aloud. The sun was dipping low, brushing the tops of the hedges with gold. I closed my eyes and listened. Birdsong, a distant laugh, the creak of the greenhouse door. My house was alive again, not just with sound, but with continuity. I wasn't merely living in it, I was part of its living story. The village fair came in late June, as it always did. Flags strung across the main square, stalls selling jam and hand-knitted socks, the brass band playing songs nobody really remembered the names of. I hadn't attended since Eleanor passed. Too many memories, too many questions from well-meaning neighbors. "But this year," Lily insisted, "we need your expert judging for the cake contest," she said, holding my hand with such finality I couldn't possibly refuse. So I went, cardigan buttoned, hat slightly askew, heart cautiously open. It felt like waking up inside a dream I used to live. The smells, the voices, the crooked laughter, they hadn't changed. I shook hands, accepted compliments on the garden, and sampled far too many slices of sponge cake. Lily dragged me from one stall to the next, while Michael carried her backpack and tried not to look like a man rediscovering joy. At one point, Clara joined us. She was quieter than I remembered, but warmer too. She handed me a jar of homemade lemon curd and said, "Thank you for not closing the door completely." We sat later on a picnic blanket just beyond the square, the four of us, watching children chase each other with balloons, the band packing up their instruments, the sun dipping behind the chapel roof. No declarations were made, no apologies repeated, just a presence shared, without tension. It struck me then that healing often arrives not in thunderclaps, but in stillness, in watching your son tie your granddaughter's shoe, in sipping lemonade that's too sweet, in not needing to look over your shoulder. When we returned home, Lily fell asleep in the car, and Michael carried her inside. He laid her gently on the sofa, covered her with my tartan throw, and stood back. I offered him a cup of tea. He accepted. We drank it quietly at the kitchen table, neither of us in a rush. Before he left, he asked, "Will you write all this down one day?" I nodded. "Already started." He smiled. "Good. I think people need to know that old stories can have new endings." That night, I wrote until my fingers cramped. I didn't worry about structure or whether it would ever be read. I wrote to honor the slow reclamation of everything I thought I had lost: connection, voice, family, even purpose. I didn't romanticize it. No dramatic turns or convenient resolutions, just the truth as it unfolded. A man who pretended to forget in order to remember. What mattered? A house that held its owner like a second skin. A son who found his father, not by saving him, but by finally seeing him. The next morning, I took my tea out to the porch. The roses were in full bloom. I counted the petals of one Eleanor had planted the year Lily was born. 28, soft yellow with blush tips. I found myself smiling, not because everything had turned out perfect, but because I was still here, still watching seasons change, still part of a story being written, one line at a time. I felt no need to chase time anymore. Let it come, let it pass. I would greet it as an old friend. Later that day, I received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph, me and Eleanor, sitting in this very garden, her head resting on my shoulder, my eyes closed in peace. On the back, in her handwriting, it read, "If you're reading this, you've made it home. I'm proud of you." I held it to my chest and let the silence wrap around me like her shawl once had. Some goodbyes are soft, some don't end, some simply change shape. That evening, I wrote the final sentence in my notebook. The truth is, I never left this house. I just forgot how to live in it. I closed the cover, placed it on the shelf beside Eleanor's poetry, and turned off the light. Outside, the night air carried the smell of cut grass and rain on stone. Inside, the house breathed with me, steady, sure, whole, not haunted, not heavy, just lived in. And for the first time in years, felt no need to leave. The next Sunday, Lily came alone. Michael dropped her off with a quick wave and a promise to return in 2 hours. She burst through the gate holding a small cake tin. "I made banana bread with Mum," she announced, "but I put the chocolate chips in." We shared it on the porch with warm milk and tea, and she told me about her teacher who couldn't pronounce photosynthesis and the boy in her class who thought tomatoes were a fruit but hated fruit. I laughed so much my ribs hurt. After we finished eating, she wandered into the garden and sat quietly beside the rose bushes. "Grandpa," she asked, "did you always live here?" I nodded. "Since before your daddy was born." She touched a petal carefully. "I hope I get to live here someday." Her voice was soft, not demanding. I looked at her, truly looked. And for the first time, I didn't see an heir or an obligation. I saw a continuation. A tender thread in the tapestry of this home's long, stubborn memory. We planted a new rose bush together. Her idea. She chose a spot near the greenhouse, where the light hits longest in the afternoon. We dug side by side, her small hands clumsy but determined. After we finished, she named it Marigold, even though I told her that wasn't quite right. "It is now," she insisted, and that was that. Children have a way of making things true simply by believing in them with enough force. Eleanor would have adored her. When Michael returned, he found us both dirt-smudged and grinning. He didn't say much, just kissed Lily's head and helped her into the car. Before they left, he turned back and said, "You know, she asks to come here more than anywhere else." I simply said, "Then she's always welcome." He nodded, eyes moist. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, even the hard parts." I wanted to say something profound, but all that came out was, "Be good to her." He smiled. "I will." That evening, I took the long route to the village by foot, past the fields and the brook. The sky was streaked in pink and copper, and the air smelled of wet hay. Every corner I turned held a memory, not always joyful, not always sad, but always mine. I passed the pub, the bakery, the little bookshop, and I nodded to each like old friends. When I reached the chapel, I stood for a moment in the shadow of its bell tower and listened. Just the wind, just time, stretching out like a slow hymn. Back home, I sat in the study and reread some of the pages I had written. Some I would keep, some I might burn, but none of them were wasted. Writing it all down had been a way of stitching myself back together, of naming what had happened, of saying, yes, this was real, and I am still here. I didn't need to publish it. I didn't need applause. I just needed to know that the story had been honored, that I had not vanished in silence. Before going to bed, I opened the small drawer where I kept the house deed. I ran my fingers across the edge of the paper, then tucked it back in place. No changes. No new names. No final decisions. Just trust waiting patiently. I closed the drawer and looked around the room once more. Every chair, every crack in the floorboards, every dent in the banister told me the same thing. This house wasn't just a place. It was proof of love endured, of grief carried, of choice reclaimed. And now, as I write this last line, I understand that the day I pretended to forget was the day I began to remember. Not just the danger of being erased, but the power of standing still, of holding space, of being seen. This house is still mine, not because I fought for it with anger, but because I stayed, because I listened, because I lived, and because I chose not to leave, even when I thought I had every reason to. Sometimes we believe we're too old for change, or that the past is something we have to carry alone. But the truth is, even the smallest choice, like staying, planting a rose, or writing a letter, can mark the beginning of something new. Not because it fixes everything, but because it honors what came before while making room for what comes next. If you've ever held on to something others tried to take, your space, your story, your voice, you know how hard it is to stand your ground quietly. Maybe you've had to pretend, to stay silent, to protect what mattered most. And maybe, like me, you've learned that the softest kind of resistance can sometimes be the most powerful. Tell me in the comments if you've lived through something similar, or if someone close to you has. Sometimes sharing the weight is what helps us carry it. And if this story touched you, feel free to share it with someone who might understand what it means to fight for the place you call home. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, real ones, quiet ones that stay with you, you're welcome here. One story at a time, we keep going.